Okay, welcome back to First Person Radio, everybody. Today we are going to start talking about power consumption and battery life. So, how to measure how long your battery is going to last with your radio, given how you operate it and how much power you're putting out. So, I've got a couple different radios today that I'm going to measure the current consumption on as best I can. And we're going to figure out how long they would last with different batteries. So I did another video already on the different kinds of batteries and voltages that you might deal with. All of these are going to be running the same battery. It's going to be a 4S lithium iron phosphate battery by Bioeno Power. It's this guy right here. It's about 14.4 fully charged, about 12 volts right at the bottom of the discharge cycle. So I should be able to get full power out of all of my radios today. So let's talk again. Let's do a little bit of review of battery terminology. So battery capacity is measured in amp hours, and that is amps times hours, right? So 1 amp times 10 hours is 10 amp hours of capacity, or 10 amps times 1 hour is 10 amp hours of capacity, right? Side note, 1 amp is 1,000 milliamps, right? So if you see MA, just divide it by 1,000 to get number of amps. And therefore, 1 amp hour is 1,000 milliamp hours, right? So usually the letter that we use to represent current, which is amps, is I. It's just kind of a convention in writing formulas, but I'm using an A today because I think it's a little easier to remember, amps. So your average amps that your radio draws is calculated with this formula. So the amps on receive, Rx, multiplied by the duty cycle on receive, DRX, plus the amps on transmit multiplied by the duty cycle on transmit. So what is this duty cycle? This duty cycle is the percentage of time that you are listening versus transmitting, right? So if I am listening half the time, I take the current I'm consuming when I'm listening times 1/2 plus the current I'm consuming while I'm transmitting times 1/2, right? I'm listening half the time, I'm transmitting half the time. I shouldn't be doing that, by the way. That's a lot of talking and not a lot of listening. So say my duty cycle is 20% talking and 80% listening. That would be receive current times 0.2 or 0.8, because 80% of the time I'm listening, plus transmit current times 0.2, because I'm only transmitting 20% of the time, and that gives me my average current consumption. And then to calculate my battery life, I just take the amp hours of my battery divided by my average current consumption, and that gives me my battery life in hours. So I hope everything makes sense. Let's get started and get a couple of radios measured. So the first one I'm going to use over here, this is a Yaesu FT857. I don't remember if this is the 857D or if this is just the old 857. Just says 857 on it. This is a 100 watt VHF UHF all mode radio. These are really popular for vehicles, and they're nice and compact, and some people like to use them backpack portable, but they can be a little bit more power hungry. To measure my current consumption, I'm going to be using my little multimeter here. One thing to be aware of is this multimeter can only take 10 amps of current. So anything greater than 10 amps, it won't be able to handle. So this guy, I actually won't be able to run it at full 100 watts using this radio or using this amp meter, because it would cook it. So we're going to have to dial it back a little bit. And I'm going to be using my little graphing calculator here because it'll save us some time with jotting things down and punching them into the calculator. I'll also be using my little dummy load here, which is only rated for 20 watts. It'll be fine for this guy because it's rated for 20 watts at a pretty high duty cycle. You can key up with 100 watts for a couple seconds. It'll be fine. And I'll also be checking the power output, but I really don't need to. I'm really just using this as a means to plug the dummy load in. And that's it. And I've got a couple different radios that I'll be testing out. So I got the Yaesu FT857. I've got the Xiegu G90, which is a wonderful pretty inexpensive Chinesium portable radio that's really easy to use, has a built-in antenna tuner. I really like it. The old standby, the Yaesu FT817 that I have with my 50-watt amplifier that I just pulled it out of my radio bag so I can sit it on the counter a little easier. And then I've got this little guy over here, which is a analog rig. It's the MFJ 9475, which is a single band 80 meter 10-watt transceiver. And the reason I picked this guy is because this thing is exceedingly power efficient. I put a little aftermarket digital display on it because I couldn't stand not knowing exactly what frequency I was on. But this will be a good example of like the absolute minimalist rig to run on very little power. All right, so let's get going. So I built this, I took this little inline fuse from like an auto parts store, and I put power poles on each end. And I use this sometimes when I want to use a fuse for a radio that doesn't have one inline. But you can also pull the fuse out and stick the contacts of your multimeter in that fuse socket. And now my multimeter is in line to measure amperage. So one note, when you're measuring amperage on the multimeter, usually you'll use the red plug will go in this socket to measure volts, ohms, or small amounts of current, milliamps. You plug it in here to measure large amounts of current, amps. So I'll just plug it in right there. And I also changed my mind. I'm not going to do the 857 first because I can't handle the full power for it. Let's just go with the old standby of the 817. So let's get this guy plugged in. Battery here. Battery here. And I'm going to plug in the radio to the dummy load so I don't damage anything if I transmit. So let's turn this guy on and we'll see what kind of power consumption we get. My little connector came out here. All right, so we are getting 0.38 amps. Now, I have a backlight on here, so let's turn that backlight off. See if I can remember how to do this. I believe I hold this button. Auto backlight. All right. Let's see here. I do not remember how to change. Oh, there we go. Backlight off. Now with the backlight off, I'm down to 0.35. All right, so that saved me 30 milliamps. Not a whole lot, but we'll do that. All right, so my received current on the 817 is 0.35 amps. So I'm going to write this down. So 0.35. And now let's transmit with 5 watts and see what current we get. I'm going to plug in, oh, wrong microphone. Okay, here we go. Oh, nope, it's still the wrong microphone. Gosh, I've got so many radios on the counter. All right. .9 amps. All right, so I'll write that down. 1.9 amps. And let's say a 20% duty cycle. So 0.8, 80% receive, and 0.20, 20% transmit. And let's say the battery that I have on there right now is a 4.5 amp hour. Okay, so now let's do our calculation. So it's the amp hour divided by the average current. So 4.5 amp hours divided by, now it is A average current. So ARX times DRX. So let me do open parentheses again. 0.35. It's a little disorienting to try and type this out while looking at it through my phone. Times 0.8, the duty cycle for receive, plus 1.9 transmit current times 0.2 transmit duty cycle. And that gives me 6.8 hours. Okay. So with that 4.5 amp hour battery, I can run for 6.8 hours on this radio setup. That's pretty dang good, since I'm not going to be just sitting here operating this radio. I would be participating in a scheduled net. So I'd power on, and I'd be on for maybe half an hour at a time. So, I mean, that could be like a week's worth of radio contacts. So that's at 5 watts. What if I can't make radio contact at 5 watts? Let me turn on my amplifier and see what that does for me. Oh, my little connector keeps coming out here. This could probably be a little bit better done. All right, so let's turn this guy on. All right, so my amplifier is on, and now my receive current is increased by 100 milliamps. So 0.45, so I'll do 817 amplified. Okay, so 0.45, still 0.8. Now my transmit current, let's see what we get. Try and find the right microphone this time. About 6.8 to 6.7. And that was probably putting out something like 35 watts, maybe 40 watts. So let's see, 6.8, 6.7, 0.2. So the other thing is, when I'm talking, it's actually not going to be pulling that maximum current the whole time. This just gives me a little extra fudge factor. It'll actually probably last a little bit longer. But the most important thing is your receive current, because most of the time you're receiving, so that's the most important current for you to worry about most of the time. All right, so let's say we still have a 4.5 amp hour battery. Now let's redo that. So I'm just going to go back and edit this. This was 6.7. And then this was 0.45. Okay, so now 2.6 hours. 2.6 hours of operation with the 50 watt amplifier. So that definitely cut down my operating time, right? But it might be necessary so I can be heard. So lesson learned. Don't use my amplifier unless I have to, because it sucks down the battery. Who would have thunk? All right, so now let's take a look at the 857, and we will do those same measurements with those same power outputs, because this guy has adjustable power output. And I hear folks say, well, I'll just buy the 857 and I will use it on low power if I want to reduce my battery consumption, which, you know, might work, but it's probably not going to be quite as efficient, and we'll see why in just a little bit. So let me get the radio plugged into the dummy load, because I really don't want to key up with 100 watts without having a dummy load connected. That could bust this thing pretty quick. All right. So power on. Well, look at that. 0.67 on receive current. Now I could figure out how to turn off the backlight. Somewhere in here. And that might save me a little bit. But it might take me a while to find that setting. Should have probably pulled that setting before I started recording, but You live and learn. I must have scrolled over it. Well, that's all right. I'm not going to worry about it, but I will worry about this one. This is my RF output power. So 5 watts out. So 0.67 on receive. So 857, 0.67. And now on transmit, let's see what we do here. 4.15. I don't have to whistle, thankfully, because I have it in FM mode. It'll put out exactly 5 watts. Wonderful. And that was, hold on, 4.15, I think? Yeah, pretty close. 4.15. And we'll still use 0.8 and 0.2. And we'll pretend that we're going to still use the same size battery on it, just to make sure this is an apples to apples comparison. All right, so this was 4.15. We'll say 4.1. And then 0.67. 3.31. All right, so look at that. This is 5 watts. This is 5 watts. So I get half of the battery life using this big guy dialed down to 5 watts as using the little one that's designed for it, right? So now let's see what I end up with if I actually turn this puppy up to 50 watts. All right. Oh, wrong mic again. .4. 9.45 amps. All right. Let's see. 9.45, still the same. So this will be 857 at 5 watts, and this will be 857 at 50 watts. And I don't have a current meter that goes up to the 20 amps that this guy will draw on 100 watt transmit, or nearly 20 amps. So we're not going to be able to measure that today, but you could just guess that it'll put out the full rated current consumption of 20 amps and go that way, and you'll probably get pretty close. And again, that little guy will not put out 10 amps of current to run this radio, but again, for apples to apples comparison, let's pretend like we have a 4.5 amp hour lithium ion battery that will. All right, so that was 9.45, so we'll say 9.5. 0.5, and then the receive current stays the same. 1.84, okay. And this is probably about 40 watts. It's a 50 watt amplifier. I don't actually get 50 watts output on it. All right, so significantly less, but it's starting to get a little bit more competitive when you get into the higher power output levels. So this guy would be great for putting out more power when you have to. Other than that, it's a lot heavier than the 817 and a lot less power efficient. So I would consider that a vehicle radio. All right, so let me power that guy off, and now let's go to the other end of the spectrum and measure this little guy, the MFJ. I don't use the MFJ much. It's an analog radio, so you have to turn the dial to tune to what frequency you want, and there's no clicks. and it's never exactly at the frequency. So you're kind of fiddling with it to get the audio to sound right. It's a little difficult to get it tuned. It's a little drifty. So it's kind of a fun radio, and it can be a practical radio, but it definitely is not as easy to operate as some of these others. So keep that in mind, right? But they're not very expensive. I think you can get these for like $250. But honestly, I would not recommend this as a starter radio. I'm just using it as an example of older gear that's extremely power efficient. So speaking of, let's power it on. So see, I turn the dial and my frequency changes, and it's never like exactly at an even kilohertz until I, kind of twiddle with the dial to get it there. Look at that, 130 milliamps of receive current. That is extremely low. So we'll say MFJ. By the way, that's a 10 watt transmitter, roughly. So 0.13, 0.8, and then our transmitting current. Let me make sure I got this guy plugged in to the dummy load. And I think this has a tune button. 1.33 tune, but I think that is only 5 watts out. Yeah, that's a 5 watt. So let me oh no, that's all it does. 5 watts out. Maybe more like 6. Yep, 1.35 on transmit. That's very good. Better than the Yaesu. Again, same battery. Let's see what that looks like. 1.4. And then 130 milliamps on receive. 11.7 hours. Okay. So yeah, if you're really running on a shoestring power budget, an old analog rig might do just fine. They don't typically do super well getting dragged around in the field though, and extreme temperatures can change the frequency that they operate on, so they'll start to get more and more drifty, and you'll have to keep tweaking the tuning as you go. But they do make some nice modern rigs that have extremely low receive current and are extremely power efficient, like an Elecraft that is not a whole lot more current than the MFJ and is way better of a radio, but the Elecrafts are very expensive. Okay, so we measured a couple different radios. I could measure the Yaesu, but I think you get the idea. The Yaesu is about, I think it was 0.5 on receive, and I want to say that on transmit, oh hell, I'll do it real quick. I'm not going to talk you guys through it. I'm just gonna measure the transmit current to compare, because I actually think the Yaesu is probably the best starter radio if you don't know what to get, because it's reasonably power efficient. It puts out 20 watts of power, which I think is right about the sweet spot. It's more than QRP low power levels that can be kind of frustrating, but it's not so much that you end up with a radio that's way heavier than you want and that eats through batteries like nobody's business. I think it's about the perfect middle ground for field operations when you're trying to be heard and not trying to necessarily be like a top-tier contester. And the other really great thing about the Yaesu, okay, I'm plugged in with the power meter and the dummy load, is that it has this great spectrum display on the front that when I'm connected to the antenna, you'll see spikes of all the audio signals. So as I scroll around, it makes it a lot easier to find signals. You can see signals several kilohertz to either side of you. So instead of scrolling through and listening, you can visually see them, which is wonderful. All right, so 0.55 receive, we'll say this is the G90, 0.8. Transmit current. Where's my microphone? Microphone plugs into the side here. This kitchen table gets kind of crowded when you got 4 radios sitting on it. All right. All right, what do we got for transmit current? 4.1. All right. 0.2. Same battery. And okay. 4.1 and 0.55. 3.57. Yeah, so that's pretty good. 20 watts. It's probably pretty comparable to the Yaesu with the amp. I mean, it's less efficient than the Yaesu with the amp slightly because the Yaesu with the amp is putting out more power, but not that big of a deal. And I think that Spectrum display is worth the trade-off because you're going to spend less time on the air because you're going to have an easier time finding who you want to talk to. We could do some other experiments in here talking about duty cycle, but it'd just be more number crunching. And the gist of it is your duty cycle, the more talking you do, it really cuts down on your battery life by a pretty dramatic amount. And you should spend more time listening than you spend talking anyways. So duty cycle matters, and your receive current is more important than your transmit current efficiency, because saving a little bit here adds up when 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10 you're using this amount of current and not that amount of current. So prioritize receive current and have low duty cycle, and you can really stretch out your battery life. All right, I hope that was helpful. This same technique, these same formulas can kind of be used in reverse in terms of amp hours and amps and current and all that to calculate how big of a solar panel you'll need. If I do this same calculation and figure out my average amps, and then I figure out how many hours a day, I can figure out how many amp hours at 12 volts I'm going to need in capacity. And then I can do this kind of calculation backwards and figure out how big of a solar panel I need to provide that number of amp hours. And I will do a separate video on that because solar panels are a little bit different and we need to talk about charging, but that will be for another video. I hope this was helpful, and go ahead and look up the receive and transmit current on your radio, even if you can't directly measure it, or better yet, measure it directly, and figure out how long your battery will last, and let me know if you run into any issues with it. Catch you next time.